I'm not super young, so I've got maybe years under my belt.
Mhm.
But I think maybe we'll just go back a little bit. I was actually working at UBC as a research assistant.
Hello and welcome to the podcast, Dr. Sarah Harper. I'm very excited to have you on the podcast. Welcome.
Thanks, Isaac. It's great to be here, and thanks for inviting
Fantastic.
me.
And Dr. Harper is currently a coordinator at the Great Bear Initiative, and she holds a PhD from the University of British Columbia. That's where I actually, met her. She is one of my mentors. And I thought I would bring her on the podcast to share, some of her experiences accomplishing the PhD and now currently working with, different stakeholders across Canada and even globally with the view to just, possibly learn from these experiences. So, Dr. Harper, do you care to just tell us about your story? Who is Dr. Harper?
Sure. Thank you, Isaac. Um, where to start? I mean, I'm not super young, so I've got many years under my belt.
Mhm.
But I think maybe we'll just go back a little bit. I was actually working at UBC as a research assistant after my master's degree.
Yes.
And I worked doing a variety of different research projects in what was formerly the Fisheries Center at
Yes.
the University of British Columbia. And, got to work on a lot of different people's projects. And after a few years, I started to get a bit frustrated that I was, supporting all these different projects, which was great, but that,
Yes.
I wanted to kind of lead my own project. Um, so I actually took some courses, which as a staff at UBC was amazing
Yes.
benefit of being a staff is being able to take courses for free. And I took a fisheries economics course with what turned out to be my PhD supervisor, Rashid Sumaila.
Yes.
And he was such a great teacher and kind of planted the seed in my head of, maybe one day doing my PhD. And I'd never really considered it before. I thought, I'd done my master's. I didn't really want to do a whole bunch more schooling. I really
Yes.
liked research, but I had never really thought about it. And it wasn't until he planted that seed that I kind of started to think about it a little bit more and more. But I also was at this sort of crossroads in my life where I also
Mhm.
wanted to start a family.
Yes.
So what I did is I applied for starting my PhD, and at the same time, I ended up getting pregnant, which
Mm.
was sort of a planned thing, but you never know when it's going to happen. And
Yes.
so I got into the PhD program. I
Mhm.
applied for some funding. I got the funding, and I decided that I would start after I took my leave from having my
Yes.
baby.
Yes.
Maybe not being fully aware of how involved it would be to have a child and to do a
Yes.
PhD.
Yes.
But about when my daughter was about 10 months old, I started taking some classes and really started my program. And it was a little hectic. It was a
Yes.
little
I know.
crazy, I'm
Yeah.
not gonna lie.
Yeah.
I definitely called up one of my teachers or one of my professors in tears one day and,
Mm.
was like, I don't know how I'm gonna make it through this reading list that was massive. I was
Yes.
pretty sleep deprived, as I'm sure any parent out there can identify with. Sleep is not something that comes to every child
Yes.
or every parent. So yeah, I started my PhD. My supervisor, Rashid Sumala, was incredibly supportive
Yes.
and was, fairly hands off, which is really what I needed at that
Yes.
stage to be able to kind of, develop my schedule as it fit my family life. But one of the really best things about being a student at UBC
Yes.
at that stage was having access to the daycare system at the
Yes.
university, which was amazing.
Yes.
And there was definitely points in my PhD where I wasn't sure I wanted to continue. It was just a lot of work. But then I
Mhm.
was like, but my daughter's at this great daycare, so I have to
Yes.
keep going. So really, I think it was both a challenging time, but also a really great time to do my PhD because I did have probably a lot more flexibility with my schedule
Hmm.
than I would have if I was, full time working at a kind of regular job. And so that was really good because, as you know, Isaac, when you have
Yes.
young children, they pick up every germ under the sun and they're sick a
Yes.
lot.
Yes.
So being able to stay home, when my daughter couldn't go to daycare, that was a
Hmm.
really important part of the flexibility that my particular program offered me. And so, and
Hmm.
my, the style of supervision that I had. So that was really important. But yeah, it was definitely a challenging journey. My
Yes.
PhD was in fisheries economics, and
Yes.
I focused on a topic that I found super interesting, which I think also helped me stay engaged at times when it felt like it was maybe too difficult. I also connected with other, parents that were students, and I think that really helped us sharing that kind of those common challenges that maybe other students that didn't have kids or were at different stages didn't have. And then the other thing I think that was really important in that
Hmm.
journey was just I have my family is in Vancouver and I'm very fortunate to have a
Yes.
very kind of supportive network of people in my life. And so I think of my PhD as being really a group effort, not just by
Yes. A
me, but by,
community takes a community,
yeah,
right?
yeah. Well, they always say, it takes a village to raise a child. Well, it takes a village to
Absolutely.
get a PhD done too.
Indeed.
Um, so yeah, that was, and it took me a while because I also took a break partway through after I did my comprehensive exams, which is part
Yes.
of the PhD process. I
Yes.
had another child, so I took a
Yes.
break and had another. They had just introduced this,
Hmm.
the ability to take a leave and extend your funding, which was really helpful.
Yes.
Um, and then I came back and finished up my PhD.
Yes.
It took me probably longer than my supervisor would have estimated, but I think it got done, and I was
Wonderful.
proud of. Yeah, I was proud of it in the end. So yeah, so that was sort of my PhD journey, which felt pretty significant. But that ends, and then it's like, oh, gotta
Yes.
get a job now.
Yes.
The timing, however, was not amazing because COVID then hit, and of course, I had kids at home, trying to kind of manage that, and
Balance.
also
Yes.
yeah, balancing work. But I was able to pick up a few different postdoc positions where I got
Hmm.
to do some neat research projects, also related to fisheries and the marine environment. And that kind of carried me through for a few years. So that was really great. I got, an opportunity to work with a whole variety of people all over the world, really, because
Yes.
as you remember in COVID, everyone was online. So
Yes.
I ended up working with people that I've actually never seen in person, but you develop these great relationships
Mm.
over Zoom, which we kind of never really thought was an option in the past, but
Yes.
we all became pretty comfortable with that. So yeah, so I did a couple of postdocs through the University of Victoria, and then more recently have started working for an Indigenous organization that supports the governments of 8 different First Nations on the coast of British Columbia.
Yes.
And that's related to fisheries management, collaborative management of fisheries, and supporting the implementation of an agreement that those nations have with the federal government of Canada. So yeah, really just kind of
Yes.
leveraging a lot of the knowledge and experiences I had, but in a much more hands-on, practical
Yes.
kind of way. So yeah.
Yes, that's a mouthful. And I'm gonna explore a little bit more on some of the things that you mentioned, but also I just wanted to also give a more context, to the audience. So in terms of the PhD at the University of British Columbia, to the extent that I know, but before I say that, You and I, we had a very wonderful supervisor, Dr. Sumaila. He's wonderful. He was also my supervisor for my second master's degree. And that's that kind of like, really motivated and made, our experiences at UBC much better. So the PhD program, how it works, from my understanding, is that you do a series of courses for the coursework. I think usually maybe the first 2 years, right? So there are some that are compulsory depending on the degree program, and then you have some electives. Maybe, for example, you want to do, R or statistics that might be useful in the research stage. And then after that, from my understanding, is that you get a list of readings. In my case, I started off, I initially wanted to do a PhD, then I decided to transition into a second master's degree program. I remember I had 150, papers, readings on the reading list that you read and then prepare for a comprehensive, for like pretty much, like they just ask you, right? It's more like a comprehensive exam. So that one is a very, very interesting experience because once you pass that, you pass the coursework and you pass that comprehensive exam, then you become a PhD candidate, right? And then after that, you focus on, now doing research. Now, maybe you can, then write the thesis, which can take maybe 2 or 3 years or even more, like from what Dr. Harper mentioned. So I thought I would just, give context that the PhD programs, to the extent that I know here in Canada, especially at UBC, it's like at least 4 years. And what usually happens is the other key thing is you need funding. So when you get funding for the 4 years, right? So this can be in terms of scholarships, but also what helps is having a wonderful, supervisor. So that is something that is very interesting. And now it's very interesting that you had a very smart way, I would say, of navigating through work-life balance. Because I remember sometimes I would see you with one of your daughters or your daughters, maybe after picking her up, and still you managed to finish the PhD. That was a really solitary achievement. Congratulations again. So, having done that, what are the some of the things that you have learned? Because I know you have done some consultants and you're actually working. What are some of the key challenges that, as a woman, you may have experienced, or you wish probably you knew, if you knew, that would have, made your experience much better?
I mean, there was definitely there have been challenges along the way, but I mean, I feel very fortunate and, I think I'm in a very privileged position in many
Sure.
ways. I also, happen to be white, which makes me very, privileged in the workplace and, women definitely, I mean, it's definitely different now than when I hear stories of when my mom was,
Yes.
navigating work-life balance. And so I do feel very fortunate in that sense. That being
Amazing.
said, I think one of the challenges, certainly in academia, and this is, maybe in part why I really kind of struggled to kind of picture myself in the long run in academia, is that, I do feel like you have to, um, it is hard to find kind of work-life balance in some
Yes.
ways, especially if you're going for, you're having to write grants and you're going for tenure and all that kind of stuff.
Mhm.
And, it requires, I think, having at least one person in a couple be very flexible and being able to take on the sort of the share
The
of
long nights.
the parenting load.
Yes.
And I mean, I have a super supportive husband. He's
Yes.
a really equal partner in many respects, but he also has a job
Yes.
that, he has to be away sometimes for. And
Yes.
so, I think that presents some challenges. Now, on the flip side, during COVID, nobody was going anywhere. So, that did make it easier in some ways, but I think it actually made it harder in other ways
Yes.
because, I was working from home. I've been working from home for probably since the beginning of COVID.
Yes.
And I've learned to navigate that and try to kind of establish certain boundaries. But some
Yes.
days my kids are here and they're all over the place. And they, you tell them, you're like, I'm in a meeting. And they're like, Mom, I need a snack or like,
Yeah.
whatever it is. And their need is, immediate. And so you have to kind of, it's hard sometimes to
Yes.
balance that. However, I've also become very good at focusing and just ignoring what else is happening.
Yes.
So I think you adapt, whatever the situation. But, I would say, these last probably decade of my life has been an exercise in trying to
Yes.
figure out, work life balance and boundaries too,
Yes.
especially where there is kind of this fluidity between work and the rest of your
And
life. And,
yeah.
some of that is good, but some of it can be overwhelming and too much.
Yes.
And, we all need to step away from our desks at times and have time to just kind of decompress. And I think that is a challenging thing, probably in any job, but particularly in the time we're at now.
Yes. And you and I, we are fortunate to be in Canada. You also mentioned something that you had the privilege of getting a paid leave. I remember I think in the US people can get I think 4 months paid and probably maybe there's no guarantee that when you come back your job will be there. But in Canada, what happens is when you are working, you'll be contributing towards that in form of employment insurance. And let's say if you are laid off from work, after serving, of course, a minimum number of hours and other conditions, you then can get, some, money through the Employment and Social Development Canada. So that kind of like eases, the stress. So that's something that I like about, the Canadian government in that regard. So that's interesting. Now, as you know, on this podcast, we also talk about, personal finance and investing, but this is not investment advice. It's just me and Dr. Harper just sharing our personal experiences in terms of personal finance and investing. In case maybe you can learn something from it. Now, is there anything that you want to share about, personal finance and investing?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, just while we're on the theme of kids, maybe first off,
Yeah.
I really was a bit naive in understanding how expensive kids are, especially in a
Yes.
city like Vancouver, where I live. It's an expensive city.
Yes.
That being said, the Canadian government does offer incentives to put aside money
Hmm.
for your kids as
Yeah.
soon as they're born up until the age of, I think,
Child benefit.
16. Yeah,
Yeah.
well, the child benefit, but there's also what's called, and you probably know more about
Hmm.
this, but the RESP, which is
Yes.
a savings plan for kids, and
Hmm.
the Canadian government matches a certain amount.
Yes.
And so it's a really good
Very
incentive
much
to
so.
save. And so, I think we really tried to maximize that
Hmm.
savings as we went, as we had our kids and throughout, even though it felt really tricky to do when I was a student,
Yes.
um, because as you know
Yeah.
how investing works. I mean, it
Yes.
really does add up and compounds, and
Yes.
when they get to the age of wanting to go to university or wanting to go to
Yes.
college, that money is available
Yes.
for them. And so, and particularly where my husband and I are having kids a bit later in life, like I'm 45, my husband's 52,
Hmm.
our kids are like, my husband might be starting to think about retirement when our kids
Retirement.
are going through university. And so,
Yes.
thinking ahead, it's hard to
Mm.
do in many ways, particularly when we were in those COVID years where everything was very like, let's just get through now.
Unpredictable.
Um,
Yeah.
but I am grateful that we really tried to make an effort to
Yeah.
do that investing for the future, for our kids' future at that point in time.
Hmm.
So yeah, I think that would be one of the biggest kind of things that, I would want to share with people in terms
Yeah.
of, something
Investing
that.
for kids. Thank you for tuning in to this podcast. Only 31% of the people who tune in to watch this podcast they are subscribed. So I want to encourage you to please subscribe so that this content can reach far and wide. Thank you again, and may the markets be with you. I wanted
Yeah,
to
for
add
sure.
something there, Dr. Harper. So, I grew up in Zimbabwe, and I would find even my community and sometimes even my parents, a situation where just before the term begins, people start looking for, school fees and stuff like that. So what you said is profound because now in Canada, there's the Registered Education Savings Fund. So if you put 2,500 per year, the government can give you $500. So that's a very good return even before you even, invest that money, right? You're setting aside 2,500 and the government, matches that with 500 and it's available on Canada Revenue Agent's website and that's the official place to find that information. And the good thing is now this money would be if you invest it wisely and it compounds, it would be earmarked towards education. Now, let's say your kid then wants to go to study in Australia or at Harvard or whatever, university. After 18 years, if you consistently invest, what it means is like the conversation would not be in that case, hopefully, about, I can't afford this, but it's like, okay, is this something that you really like? Do you want us to go and visit the university so that you can really be sure of what you want to, to do? So that is very, very powerful. So I appreciate you bringing that, and we also do that consistently. Yeah. So please go ahead.
So yeah, no, I think it's a great program and, obviously it's not, it would be great if every country in the world had it. I know that's not always the
Yeah.
case, but I think even some people in Canada who are eligible for that program don't always know about it, or they find
Yes.
out kind of later on.
Yeah.
And one thing I did learn about that program recently is that you can, if you do miss years in maximizing that amount that the federal government will contribute, that you can kind of make up for that lost time
Hmm.
in some ways. So yeah, so that's kind of an important option, I think, that would be good for people to know about. But I think the other kind of, I don't know if this was smart planning on my part, but one of the
Hmm.
things that has been very sort of lucky or serendipitous is
Hmm.
we were able to get into the housing market in
Real
Vancouver, which is a
estate.
very, very expensive
Yes.
city. But and the reason we were able to do it is sort of through a variety of fortunate circumstances.
Yes.
But really, kind of I think the takeaway message that I wanted to share about that is that, I think when thinking about housing, you really have to kind of think outside the box and be a bit creative in how you piece it together. And, I think for me that meant, potentially, making some compromises about exactly where or sort of how big the space that I'd be living in was,
Yes.
but ultimately getting that kind of foot in the door was so important.
Yes.
And I just recently witnessed, a family member do something similar where,
Yes.
they were looking for kind of something for quite a while. And then once they started sort of shifting kind of
Yes.
either the scope of what they were looking for, the type of thing, they got into a market and, just the amount of relief that they felt by,
Yes.
going from being a renter to being able to have, even just a toe in the market
Yes.
was really important. And so, again, it feels very impossible, and I know it's not an option for everyone, but
Yeah.
we were very fortunate. And I think that was kind of, it was a bit of a leap of faith at the time that it
Yes.
would work out. And so
But looking
I'm
back now, it was, a stroke of ingenuity, right? And that's usually
totally,
what, decisions in investment, like the way that I look at it. But more for context, Dr. Harper is like how it works in Canada. Usually for real estate, you need a down payment. Let's say you want to get into a property for 600,000. And, if you have 20%, that means I think 120,000, that would be, just down payment. And then the bank will then give you a loan for the difference, right? So if you want to reduce, this is not investment advice, but just sharing insights. You then, can lower your premiums, insurance premium, because if you have a higher down payment, at least 20%, then the risk of, possibly defaulting might be lower also depending on income, your credit score. So every 5-year term, you can go and, they reevaluate to say, how is your income? And then when you are paying off that principal and interest, the home ownership, in terms of the equity probably can increase. But I always want to tell people to say, always important to run numbers because sometimes it makes sense to rent than to jump into a property or buy something that you can afford. I've seen that when you do the maths, the first, I think, 15 years of a, let's say, the 25-year mortgage, right? Is most of the money is going towards the interest. And then the later years, then it goes towards principal. But some people, what they do, they put an extra income money there and it can shave off maybe 3, 4, 5 years from the 25-year amortization period. So these are some of the things that I share, of course, on my podcast. But this is something that is very interesting that you jumped into the house, and when you look back, the property prices have appreciated, and you are also even, like you have a place to stay that you're comfortable. You don't have to worry about, if the house owner says, if you're renting, I want to renovate, I want to do this. So that can bring a modicum of stability to the family. So that's wonderful to share. Yeah, please, is there something that you want to add on that?
No, I don't think so. Yeah, I feel quite fortunate and
Yes,
just yesterday actually my husband and I were talking about how, it's so easy sometimes. You look around Vancouver,
yes.
there's like such a range of wealth and sizes of houses, and it's easy to sometimes be like, oh, wouldn't it be nice if,
Yes.
but then you forget to kind of reflect on your own
And
situation and
appreciate what you have.
well, exactly. And so we just had that kind of moment of reflection and we're like, yeah, we're really lucky and
Yeah.
it's really
You have a
appreciative. So
comfortable place, you have wonderful kids, you have, jobs, you have family. So I think it's a very profound thing to also be thankful. That's how I also like to live my life. And I was going to add that, in Canada, there are also, registered accounts. Some people, may not know this. They are what are called tax-free savings account. And this differs, in the US, they have different, it's just the names, right? In the UK, in Australia, but in Canada, we have the tax-free savings account, and the government gives you a limit to say you can contribute, let's say 8,000 this year if you were born a certain period. This information is available on Canada Revenue Agents. And then there's the registered retirement savings plan, wherein you can invest, but then that one you have tax deduction. Let's say if your income is 100,000, the taxable income is, let's say, 70,000, and you can kind of like, reduce your income, your tax in the present because it's deferred. When you then withdraw it, let's say when you are 71 years, if you withdraw now, then you are going to get, a punitive tax, maybe even 20%, depending on the province. So these are some of the things that I wish I knew because you can then take advantage of that. There's the first home buyer's account, and it's a whole variety of, investment vehicles. And also in Quebec, it's different, but there's also, the Quebec pension plan. But for those outside of Quebec, there's the Canada pension plan. So these are some of the things that sometimes people, then get to a point where they have a retirement age, like you mentioned, right? And then when they start to run the numbers to say, what are our monthly living expenses? Let's say it's like 3,000. You have a mortgage, you have this. But if you then had been investing and you have some cash flows, it kind of eases, some stress. And the way that I look at retirement and financial freedom is kind of interesting because a lot of people, from my experience, think like when I retire, it's very boring to just wake up and sit, right? But it's kind of nice to say I don't have to worry about money. Like in your case, I'm sure you may like, consultants or, spending time with family and stuff. But just having that flexibility, but it starts by thinking and planning about, those things, step by step. So that's wonderful. Now, given that you have this wide experience, Dr. Harper, yeah, PhD, you're working in with different stakeholders, you've done some consultants. What are some of the things that you would just say as parting shot in terms of like major things you have learned over this life?
Yeah, that's a great question. And um, I know I've learned a lot of things,
Yes,
but some of the things that well, I've learned a ton of things
for
in terms
sure.
of new skills, new information, but
Yes,
some of the things that I've been reflecting on a lot lately, particularly because I'm in a job that I really like, that is a
yes.
very supportive work environment with really interesting and great
You see
people
the
that I'm working
impact
with.
too.
Yeah, exactly. And so, it's got me thinking back through my work at what some of the kind of common themes are in work settings or in projects that I really like. And I think the thing that I always come back to is that, those situations that were really positive and left a real impression is getting to work with really kind and generous people who are really interesting and really willing to kind of share their insights. And so I think if I was to reflect on my experiences and then sort of share whatever wisdom I can impart, it would be find those people that are gonna kind of be supportive and be nurturing and be um, you'll be able to learn from and engage with them, stay in touch with them. And I know, Isaac, you're really good at that. When
Thank
whenever
you.
we're having a coffee, you're talking about your different mentors, and
Yes.
it's such an important thing. And I know it's something that you probably people hear again and again, but it's something that I feel like has resonated, especially at this stage of my life where I think about the people who have, I might not talk to on a super frequent basis, but when I
Yeah.
connect with them, they are so pivotal in helping to guide me or in bouncing ideas off of. And then also just,
Hmm.
those are the kind of people that make work really enjoyable. And so I think at this stage of my career, obviously like the subject matter, I
Yes.
gravitate towards things that I know something about or have skills in, but the things that I think make the job fulfilling and hopefully long lasting are those relationships and the people that make it kind of make the job. And so I think, focusing on building and maintaining relationships is
Hmm.
such an important part at this stage of my career because, we all know that we live in a kind of world where jobs are uncertain.
Yes.
We always, and certainly the work that I've been involved in, the funding for them is not necessarily ongoing. These are not necessarily jobs that may be around
Yeah.
forever, but it's those relationships that you maintain throughout your career that will, potentially help you find that next job or will help provide some advice. And, I only hope that those relationships are reciprocal and that I also am there kind of for those people and providing that, support and mentorship where I can. And so I guess I would emphasize just
Hmm.
the value of kind of that social capital, if you want to kind
Yes.
of talk about it in that way. And, there's obviously that the money you take home in your paycheck, but I think even more important than that, is that social capital that you kind of develop because I think that is your kind of safety net in times of
Yes.
uncertainty or where, the funding for your job might end or, your company might be restructured, but it's, that social capital that you've developed throughout your
Yes.
career or throughout your
The
life that
skills.
Yeah, that will really kind of soften the landing and get you back on your feet. So I think, those are the lessons that I think kind of I keep sort of learning and relearning or get reminded of
Yeah.
in different situations. And certainly like looking back on the last, 5, 6 years where I finished my PhD and was like trying to get my feet under me with a career, with the new learning that I had from my PhD, but also in a time of, a very tumultuous time with like COVID and, all these restrictions and companies not sort of, and then now, a lot of companies are sort of in a bit of a restricted growth phase too.
Yes.
So yeah, I think
Yeah.
when I think about it, it's a lot of, the things that I've developed kind of in terms of those relationships that's really helped me through that.
Dr. Harper, you're very kind, I must say. And you're also one of those people, I will say, let's say if there's a critical decision that I want to make in terms of my career, I think of, and you have always been very gracious to be honest and authentic in terms of sharing your insights. Like, Isaac, if you thought about this, if you thought about this, and even sometimes sharing opportunities, I really appreciate you in that regard. And in conclusion, something that I will also share, I remember our supervisor, Dr. Smaila. He's a wonderful, person, very famous, but very humble. When I completed my master's, I said, now I'm so happy that I will have all this time, in the world to relax because, well, this academic life has been very stressful. Even though it was rewarding, it's like, oh, now you have finished one chapter. There's another chapter, Isaac. Talk to me after some time and you tell me that there's still a lot more to come. So I'm glad that, after that, you navigated into another chapter, but still in life, I think what I'm learning as well is that it's important to have a balance and enjoy the present, but also dream about the future that you want and work towards it gradually to kind of like have a long-term thinking. That way, you have these experiences in the present, but also enjoy, life throughout the whole process. So with that, I have the privilege of having you. Thank you so much for the privilege of your time. And I hope our dear listeners will enjoy this conversation. And until next time, please stay tuned and may the markets be with you. Thank you again.
Thanks.
Uh,